Higher order metaphysics is a rapidly developing area of study in analytic metaphysics that is characterized by the extensive use of logic and other technical tools. You're probably familiar with the classic problems of metaphysics: the ship of Theseus, free will and moral responsibility, personal identity, the forms, and all that good stuff. And well, higher order metaphysics looks quite a bit different from classical metaphysics. For example, compare David Wiggins on being in the same place at the same time with Kean Doerr's 2017 paper To be F is to be G. While Wiggins writes a relatively short article, it is a good representative of how modern metaphysics is typically done. With a quick scroll through, we can see mostly text and a bit of symbolism. Doerr's paper is one of the first major installments in the contemporary higher order metaphysics program, and upon first glance, we can see that this paper is quite a bit different from Wiggins. At over 90 pages long, it has an extended appendix of just proofs and theory. While rather long, even by higher order metaphysician standards, this is not atypical for the program. Needless to say, the practice of higher order metaphysics is quite a departure from metaphysics as a whole. Taking a step back, it is natural to ask, how did we get here? I want to trace the history of higher order metaphysics. In particular, I want to answer the questions: what are the motivations for higher order metaphysics? Why is natural language playing second fiddle to logic? And what's the deal with structure and grain? Our history starts with the famed German mathematician, philosopher, and father of modern logic, Gottlob Frege. In his book, The Foundations of Arithmetic, Frege sets out to analyze and define the concept of number just using logic. An important principle for us to consider is his context principle. The idea of the context principle is that it is impossible for us to define a word or a concept out of context. For example, I can't define the word bank until you give me a context within which it's being used. In financial context, it's a financial institution. In the context of fishing, it's a piece of land that touches the river. In the context of flying, it's the angle of a turn. For Frege, then, we can't just outright say what the word number means, but we can give the logical conditions for the concept of a number when the word is used in a given context. So, Frege sets out to give the conditions for the phrase the number of in the context of identity. In other words, if Frege can give logical conditions for whenever the phrase the number of f's is the number of g's is true, then Frege succeeds in defining the concept of a number while adhering to the context principle. Frege proposes that the number of f's is the number of g's if and only if there is a one-to-one correspondence between all the f's and g's. So, the number of apples is the number of oranges just in case we can line up each apple with a unique orange and vice versa. Defining numbers in this way is the first step to giving purely logical foundations for arithmetic, which could then be used to give purely logical foundations for all of mathematics. The view that mathematics is reducible to logic is called logicism. While Frege was famously unsuccessful in his logicist project because of Russell's paradox, Frege's context principle proved to be immensely important in the future of philosophy. By it, Frege is paying close attention to how language is being used and making philosophical distinctions and claims based on how we say things. This is called the linguistic turn. After Frege, philosophers in the West begin paying more attention to language and will try to use it as a sort of window to peer into deeper reality. Our next stop is the logical empiricists. Logical empiricism was less of a single position and more of a movement that spawned following Frege's work. They hop on the linguistic turn train and view philosophy as a sort of linguistic project that takes into account contemporary scientific discoveries and tries to revamp language to better talk about the way things are. Particularly, they wanted to recast natural language using scientific terms, mathematics, and logic. Now, as is typical with the logical empiricists, there are a number of caveats to what I just said. Firstly, the degree to which the logical empiricists thought science deflated philosophy was variable. Rudolf Carnap, perhaps the most influential and notable logical empiricist, thought science deflated philosophy quite a bit, though not as much as others like Otto Neurath. Secondly, the extent to which the logical empiricists thought there really was a way things are is difficult to pin down. It can be said somewhat safely that they thought there was something, but how deep that something went and how much there was to say about it depended on the thinker and the work. However, what was characteristic of the logical empiricists as a whole, and what matters most for us, is that they thought metaphysics was not the way to learn more about what there was, but rather science. So, metaphysics was largely rejected as a serious discipline by the logical empiricists and found to be too speculative to take seriously. It is worth pausing to note what kind of metaphysics the logical empiricists were thinking about specifically. While the critique definitely concerns all of metaphysics, what they have in mind more specifically is metaphysics as the study of the deeper things of reality, or, as we might say, the structure of reality. And this idea of structure will keep popping up throughout our journey. The logical empiricists disliked this idea that came almost implicit with the serious study of metaphysics, that there was something deeper or some further fact about the way things are that needs deep philosophical inquiry to discover. Their thought was that all these questions are either ill-formed or will be illumined by further scientific progress. With that out of the way, we can move on to our next step, which is Quine's critique of logical empiricism and his foundations of ontology. In his paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, Willard Van Orman Quine puts to rest logical empiricism for good. Whether or not he actually succeeded philosophically is hotly debated, though after this paper, logical empiricism loses its favor among contemporary philosophers. With this, he begins in his own project in ontology, the branch of metaphysics that studies existence. Most important for us is his famous paper on what there is. In it, he gives his famous doctrine on what exists. To be is to be the value of a bound variable. Now, like everything else in philosophy, it's a matter of controversy exactly what Quine means, but we can make it a bit clearer by remembering that Quine is firmly on the linguistic turn train. He's also taking a cue from the logical empiricists and thinking that logic is a formal tool that we can use to talk about things more precisely than we can in natural language. So here's a common way of understanding Quine. In logic, there are two operators, the existential and the universal quantifier. The existential quantifier basically means there exists an x such that, and the universal quantifier basically means for all x. An existential statement is true whenever there is something that satisfies the such that. For example, there is an x such that x is a bachelor, or there is a bachelor is true just in case there really is a bachelor. We say that the variable x is a bound variable because it falls within the scope of a quantifier. In other words, in the sentence, there is an x such that x is a bachelor, the existential quantifier, there is, tells us something about the variable x. This makes x a bound variable. We say the value of x is just whatever x has to be to make the sentence true, which in this case is a bachelor. We can translate many sentences of natural language into the language of logic like this. Science produces the best descriptions of the world we have. In scientific theories, there are statements like, there are electrons, or there is an x such that x is an electron. As we saw before, this sentence is true just in case there really are electrons. In other words, it's true whenever the value of x is an electron. So, one way to take Quine is as saying that, in our best theories of reality, what exists is just whatever satisfies existential claims like there is an electron or there is a bachelor. It is important to note that, for Quine, whenever we quantify a variable, that variable can only be objects, which in natural language are just singular nouns. This is called first-order logic. Second-order logic allows you to quantify over properties, which in natural language are predicates, or statements of the form is an f. We can continue up the hierarchy of logic in the same way. Third-order logic allows you to quantify over properties of properties, and so on and so forth. Quine was deeply suspicious of anything above first-order logic, and there are some good reasons to agree with him. The reasons can get a bit technical, so we won't deal with them here. The important takeaway is that since properties and properties of properties and etc. cannot be quantified over, then they cannot be the value of any bound variable. So, for Quine, they do not exist. This is a more nominalist view of what there is, and Quine himself even says he prefers desert landscapes when it comes to ontology. Quine's doctrine, to be is to be the value of a bound variable, kickstarts metaphysics again, though only slowly at first. Philosophers are still wary about going too deep and want to maintain thin and lean ontologies. That is, until Quine's student David Lewis comes on the scene. Lewis, along with many other philosophers around this time, such as Alvin Plantinga, Saul Kripke, and David Kaplan, are very interested in modality, or the way in which a sentence is true. Most saliently, a sentence can be true either necessarily or possibly. Lewis and the others are really interested in understanding what exactly we mean when we say something is necessarily or possibly the case. To do so, a whole extension to logic is developed called modal logic, whereby we can talk about necessity and possibility formally. In modal logic, the operator "it is necessary that" is represented by a square, and the operator "it is possible that" is represented by a diamond. Lewis and the others understand phrases like "it is necessary that every human has two parents" as meaning in all possible worlds, every human has two parents. Similarly, a sentence like "it is possible that Frege is Austrian" means in some possible world, Frege is Austrian. Cashing out necessity and possibility in terms of possible worlds is called possible world semantics. These metaphysicians go crazy with possible world semantics and want to understand everything in terms of possible worlds. A classic book by Lewis called Counterfactuals sets out a way to understand sentences like "if S were the case, then R would have been the case" in terms of possible worlds. Plantinga, among many others, understands the essence of something to just be the properties it has in every possible world. We'll eventually tug on this string about essences and modality a bit more, but it is worth it to pause to see the extent to which Quine influenced these debates. You might have noticed that we have been talking about all possible worlds. If something is possibly the case, that just means there is some possible world in which that is the case. In possible world semantics, we are quantifying over possible worlds. If we take Quine's doctrine seriously, then it seems like possible worlds really exist. For example, if it is possible that Frege was Austrian and not German, then there is some possible world where Frege is Austrian and not German. In other words, there is an X such that X is a possible world, and in X, Frege is Austrian. In that sentence, X is a bound variable, and its value will have to be a possible world. So, by Quine's doctrine, there really are possible worlds. These possible worlds don't just exist possibly, but actually. They exist just as much as our world exists. David Lewis takes this seriously and in his very famous book on the plurality of worlds argues as much, in a position which is called modal realism. While Quinean in some ways, we should notice that an ontology that includes every possible world is far from Quine's desert landscape. Many philosophers had issue with Lewis on this point, and so a popular position that was spearheaded by Plantinga called actualism said possible worlds exist, just not as much as our world does. Rather, they exist abstractly. Even though modal realism was never seriously held by many philosophers, it opened the floodgates for heavy-duty metaphysics and anything but desert landscape ontologies. Before we move on, I'll also note a subtle shift in the overall project of metaphysics. For the logical empiricists in Quine, metaphysics was largely about ontology and asking the question of what exists. With the metaphysicians in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, their attention is captured less by ontological questions and more by questions about how things are. That is to say, they're less interested in telling you what exists and what is the case, and more interested in telling you how to classify whatever is the case and how everything relates to each other, whatever there is. This shift will become greater the further we go along. Moving into the 90s and early 2000s, much of the discussion will center around the philosopher Kit Fine. If you'll recall, one thing many metaphysicians at this time thought was that essences were just necessary properties. In his famous paper, Essence and Modality, Kit Fine critiques this position. He argues that the essence of something is whatever makes that thing that thing. The essence of Socrates is whatever makes Socrates Socrates. The essence of the set that contains only Socrates, called the singleton of Socrates, is whatever makes Socrates' singleton what it is. In this case, it is being a set and containing Socrates. What this move does is generate a sort of hierarchy of the way things are. For example, the fact that Socrates exists makes the singleton of Socrates exist. So that fact sits further down than the fact that the singleton of Socrates exists. That fact makes it the case both that something is a set that contains only Socrates and that something is a set. So, from the ground of reality up, the fact that Socrates exists sits at the lowest. Then above that is the fact that the singleton of Socrates exists. And above that are the facts that there is something that is a set that contains only Socrates, and that something is a set. To say this all a little more concisely, we introduce the notion of grounding. For a fact to ground another fact just means that the first fact explains why the second fact is the case. So, the fact that Socrates exists explains or grounds the fact that the singleton of Socrates exists. The grounding relation runs only in one direction. The fact that Socrates' singleton exists doesn't ground its grounds. The notion of grounding as being central to metaphysics explodes in the early 2000s and continues to this day. Philosophers go just as crazy over grounding as the key to all of our metaphysical problems as much as philosophers thought possible worlds illumined every area of metaphysics. Different logics are developed to talk about grounding formally. So we still see the influence of Quine and the logical empiricists, even though the project of metaphysics looks very different from how they understood it. Given that grounding puts everything into relation with everything else, it is natural to view everything as occupying a unique place in a structure, such as Ted Sider in his book Writing the Book of the World, where he argues metaphysics is the study of the structure of reality, and the structure of reality contains everything related to everything else by grounding. The overall project of metaphysics moves into studying where everything fits into the structure of reality. This means figuring out what grounds what. Grounding creates a structure of reality, and the more we understand what grounds what, the better we understand the structure of reality. Grounding also makes salient the notion of grain, that is, which facts are the same and which ones are distinct. In general, ground generates a very fine-grained structure of facts. Take, for example, the fact that the singleton of Socrates exists, grounds there being something that is a set that contains only Socrates. Since one fact grounds the other, the two are distinct facts, even though we might look at the two facts and say they really mean the same thing. This is quite a bit different from someone like Quine, who might look at this and say whatever is a set that contains only Socrates just is Socrates a singleton, and vice versa. So there is only one thing and only one fact. Departing even further from Quine, since we are now interested in talking about how facts about all different kinds of things ground other facts, it becomes very useful to be able to quantify over more than just objects in our logic. So philosophers start to warm up to using second-order logic and above around this time. With all this setup out of the way, we can finally move to the 2010s and start talking about higher-order metaphysics. Worth mentioning as the granddad of higher-order metaphysics is Timothy Williamson in his 2003 book, Modal Logic as Metaphysics. In that book, Williamson argues modal logic is the primary tool and essence of metaphysical studies. He not only strengthens the connection between logic and metaphysics, but he also argues that, for a complete description of reality, we need higher-order logic also. To jump into contemporary higher-order metaphysics, I'll start with Key and Dorr's 2016 paper, To be F is to be G. In it, he considers that to be a bachelor is just to be an unmarried man. The grounding folks look at this and say that means something being unmarried and being a man together ground that thing being a bachelor. However, Dorr notices that it is just as true to say to be a bachelor is to be an unmarried man as it is to say to be an unmarried man is to be a bachelor. But if both are true, then we can't be talking about grounding. Otherwise, being a bachelor would ground being an unmarried man and vice versa, which can't happen. But if we want to talk about how the two are related, we need to have access to second-order logic. This is because to be a bachelor and to be an unmarried man are predicates. So, to talk about predicates being other predicates in general, we must be able to quantify over predicates. To push this even further, though, and make whatever we are about to say perfectly general, we need to bring in every order of logic to talk about every kind of predicate. In other words, we need higher order logic. And this is how higher order metaphysics gets its name. To bring this back to ground and grain, this means the fact that the singleton of Socrates exists cannot ground something's being a set that contains only Socrates, because to be a set that contains only Socrates is just to be Socrates' singleton. Not only does the grounding relation break down, but the grain of the structure of reality is a bit coarser. In other words, the structure of reality doesn't distinguish between there being a set that contains only Socrates and the existence of Socrates' singleton. The goal for Dorr is to come up with a general theory that governs the logic of identifying predicates with each other. What this does is give us principles by which to deflate the structure of reality and make less fine-grained distinctions between facts. And this is exactly what he does in To be F is to be G. So, higher order metaphysics makes the grain of the structure of reality coarser by making some predicates identical with other predicates, where grounding theorists would distinguish them by saying one predicate grounds another. But this also changes the structure of reality, since grounding can't be how everything is related to each other. The grounding theorists can come up with a structure of reality where facts are grouped together based off of how many and what facts ground them. Introducing the ability to identify predicates with other predicates breaks down those nice categories and distinctions. So, we need another way to group together different parts of the structure of reality. The way we do this is along two dimensions. We first group together things vertically. This is just what grounding set out to do, which is tell us how things are built up from other things. The second thing we need to do, which is different from a structure built up by grounding, is to group together things laterally. This will tell us, given some part of the structure, what things it can be identical with. Let's deal with the vertical relation first. Let's start off by noticing there's a really special relationship between John is a bachelor and to be a bachelor. In particular, John is a bachelor is a fact about the way things are, while to be a bachelor is a predicate employed by that fact, just nominalized. Another way we might understand this connection is as the same sort of connection between John as a bachelor and having the property of being a bachelor. We'll call this special relation abstraction. To be a bachelor is the predicate abstraction of John is a bachelor. In other words, if we take the fact John is a bachelor and pick out or abstract out just the predicate used in that fact, we get to be a bachelor. Some other more complicated facts abstract out a bit differently. For example, the abstract of to be a bachelor is a predicate about marital status is to be a predicate about marital status, or is a predicate about marital status. Abstraction is a little different from grounding because it can also sort of run in the other direction. If we take the abstracted predicate to be a bachelor or is a bachelor, and we give it a noun or an object, say John, we can get back to the fact John is a bachelor. Similarly, we can give is a predicate about marital status the predicate to be a bachelor to get the fact to be a bachelor is a predicate about marital status. This is a process called reduction. It's not quite an inverse relation because, given any fact, we can abstract out a predicate, but a predicate only reduces into a fact given a noun that makes the resulting sentence true. However, we can roughly think of the structure of reality going up by abstraction and going down by reduction. Next, we need to categorize the structure of reality using our general theory of predicate identification from earlier. In particular, we need to categorize things by what sorts of things a given part of the structure can be identified with. To do this, let's notice that as we build up our structure from facts, the grammatical feature at each level of abstraction stays the same. Facts are sentences, so they declare something about the way things are, and that's all there is to them. Any fact can be abstracted into a predicate like blank is an F. Predicates are not sentences but can be made into a sentence by giving it a noun. We can abstract again to get a predicate of a predicate like is an F is a blank. While it's grammatical to say something like is a bachelor is John, it makes no sense at all. For predicates of predicates, we don't just want any old noun, but specifically a noun phrase made out of a predicate. So we can say something like to be a bachelor is a predicate about marital status. The predicate of a predicate is a predicate about marital status needs another predicate to make a fact. So we can categorize things by their grammatical features, namely what sort of thing the phrase in question needs to become a fact. Facts don't need anything at all. Predicates need an object or a noun. Predicates of predicates need a predicate, and so on. We'll call the grammatical category a phrase falls into the type of the phrase, and the formal study of these categories is called type theory. Things that have the same type can be identified with each other. So, the whole structure of higher order metaphysics looks like groups of things gathered together by their type and organized by height depending on what it needs to become a fact. Higher order metaphysicians study the relations that group together phrases of the same type to learn more about the structure of reality. And this is my way of answering the question, how did we get to higher order metaphysics? Before recapping, let's return to the three questions I posed at the beginning and finally answer them. The motivations for higher order metaphysics come from the general study of structure and grain that got kicked off by the grounding craze. Higher order metaphysicians were unsatisfied with the way grounding organized the structure of reality and how finely it distinguished between facts. Natural language began playing second fiddle to logic, beginning with the logical empiricists, but in bringing back serious metaphysical inquiry, Quine cemented the role of logic as a main way metaphysics is done, with his doctrine to be the value of a bound variable. Because of Frege and the linguistic turn, we start off with natural language as our window into the structure of reality. We bring in higher order logics because we want to give perfectly general categorizations of the structure of reality. And since we can use natural language to build up all sorts of crazy constructions of predicates and properties and facts, we need to be able to talk about them in logic as well. So first order logic won't do, and we need all the higher order logics as well. The obsession with structure and grain, as opposed to Quine's concern with ontology, had its beginnings with the modal metaphysicians like Louis Plantinga and Kripke. With them, we see a very subtle shift from Quine in the central project of metaphysics. Quine and his predecessors were concerned with the question, what is there? With the modal metaphysicians, they start to become more concerned with questions like, how are things? This is pushed to the spotlight by Kit Fine and the grounding craze. With grounding and its associated logics, we can now formally talk about the structure of reality and give a metaphysical relation that relates facts, properties, and predicates. With this shift, if we don't say what exactly there is, we also need to say what kinds of things we are concerned with relating. This is the concern with grain, which tells us how much we are going to distinguish different kinds of sentences and phrases from each other. This is the context within which higher order metaphysics enters the story. Metaphysics is about structure and grain, and higher order metaphysics develops not as an objection to that study, but as a critic and alternative to the dominant theory about the structure of reality and its grain. Frege kicked things off for us with his context principle that started the linguistic turn. The logical empiricists led us to a metaphysical dark ages, but cemented the role of the study of language and the use of logic in philosophical pursuits. Quine started the age of metaphysical enlightenment and drew a close connection between the study of logic and language with serious metaphysical inquiry. Despite this, Quine was still skeptical of going too far down the metaphysical rabbit hole and encouraged lean and thin metaphysics. The modal metaphysicians don't take Quine's advice and greatly expand their ontologies, but do so rather successfully. This is because they show that by adding new tools and objects into our metaphysics, like possible worlds and modal logic, we can formally describe all sorts of different linguistic phenomena and make good headway on philosophical problems. Even though quite a bit of what they had to say probably didn't stick, they expanded the domain of metaphysics and made it a serious and rich area of study again. Following them, Kit Fine and the grounding theorists give metaphysics a new life by giving a distinguished and special relation all to itself, grounding. Metaphysics then becomes about the study of grounding and the structure of reality. Central questions concern how things are related to each other and how facts are distinguished from other facts, or questions about structure and grain. At this time, grounding is understood as the relation that describes the structure of reality. Higher order metaphysicians respond to this final claim and say that grounding is inadequate to describe the structure of reality. They produce a new structure that is described using abstraction and higher order logical identifications.